When we think of Vikings, one of the most striking images that comes to mind is the funeral pyre on a burning ship, drifting into the horizon as flames consume wood and sail. This vision has become iconic through films, literature, and art. But what was the truth behind Viking funerals, and how did these ceremonies reflect their beliefs about death, honor, and the afterlife? To understand this, we must look closely at archaeological discoveries, ancient chronicles, and the cultural values of the Norse world. Death for the Vikings was not just the end of life, it was a transition. The way a person was buried, honored, and remembered was deeply connected to their status, achievements, and community role. For them, the funeral was both a farewell and a ritual that helped guide the soul toward its next journey. The Norse believed in multiple afterlife realms. Warriors who fell bravely in battle might be taken to Valhalla, the hall of Odin, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of the world. Others might find their place in Fólkvangr, the meadow of the goddess Freya. Meanwhile, those who died ordinary deaths could go to hell, a realm that was not necessarily a place of punishment, but rather a shadowy land of the dead ruled by the goddess of the same name. Funeral practices among the Vikings varied widely depending on region, wealth, and social rank. Archaeological evidence shows both cremations and burials were practiced, sometimes side by side. For the wealthiest and most powerful, ships often played a role, whether in actual burials within boats or symbolic representations of them. Ships were central to Viking life. They represented power, mobility, and the connection between worlds. To place the dead in a vessel was to give them a vehicle for the journey beyond. One of the most important accounts of a Viking funeral comes from the Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who in the 10th century witnessed the rites of the Rus, a Norse people living along the rivers of what is now Russia. His description provides a rare outsider's perspective. According to his record, the funeral of a chieftain was elaborate, lasting several days. The body was first placed in a temporary grave while preparations were made. Goods, weapons, food, and even animals were chosen to accompany the deceased. The scale of the ceremony depended on the person's importance, but always the aim was to provide for them in the afterlife as they had lived in this one. Fire was central to these funerals. Cremation was not only a practical way of returning the body to the elements, but also a symbolic act. Flames transformed the dead from the world of the living to the world of spirits. Fire was purifying, powerful, and sacred. It dissolved the body and released the soul. In some cases, as Ibn Fadlan described, a ship was set on fire, either on land or on the water, creating the dramatic image that still fascinates us today. Yet, archaeological evidence suggests that while ship burials were real, the burning ship set to sea was likely rare and reserved for exceptional figures. Graves discovered across Scandinavia reveal much about these rituals. Some contained simple cremation urns, while others were grand mounds filled with treasures, weapons, and imported luxury goods. In places like Oseberg in Norway, entire ships were buried under earth, preserving an extraordinary collection of artifacts. These finds tell us that funerals were not only personal farewells, but also displays of power, wealth, and connection to the divine. They were performances for the living as much as transitions for the dead. The Norse placed immense importance on honor and reputation. To die with dignity and to be remembered was essential. Funerals were opportunities to reinforce these values, to celebrate bravery, and to bind the community together in mourning and memory. The rituals were not just about what happened after death, but also about the legacy that remained in the stories and songs of the people. In Viking culture, death was a passage, and the funeral marked the beginning of that journey. Fire, ship, grave goods, and ritual all played roles in guiding the soul forward. But these ceremonies were not uniform, and the diversity of practices tells us much about how flexible and rich Norse beliefs really were. To truly understand what these funerals meant, we need to explore more deeply the symbolism of ships, the role of ritual specialists, and the meaning of sacrifice in these rites. To understand Viking funerals more deeply, we must look beyond the image of burning ships and explore how these ceremonies were truly performed. Archaeology, combined with written accounts, reveals funerals that were long, complex, and filled with meaning. They were religious rites, but also social events, reminding the community of the values that bound them together. The most detailed account comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who in the 10th century described the funeral of a Rus chieftain. The body was first placed in a temporary grave while preparations began. Carpenters built a ship-shaped wooden structure, and attendants gathered goods, clothes, weapons, food, and animals to accompany the dead. The scale of the ceremony reflected the chieftain's status, but always the goal was to provide for him in the afterlife. Ritual specialists played a central role, often women. Ibn Fadlan mentioned a figure he called the Angel of Death, who organized offerings and guided the passage of the dead. Archaeological finds suggest women held spiritual authority in these rites, with charms and ritual objects frequently buried with them. Sacrifice also appeared in some funerals. Ibn Fadlan described a female slave who volunteered to join her master in death, though evidence suggests such acts were rare and reserved for the highest ranks. More common were animal sacrifices, horses, dogs, cattle, or birds, whose remains have been found in many graves. These animals symbolized wealth, offered food for the afterlife, and reflected the status of the deceased. Grave goods reveal much about Norse beliefs. Warriors were buried with swords, spears, and shields, not only as symbols of identity, but also as tools for the journey. Women often received jewelry, household objects, and keys, reflecting their roles as keepers of community life. Children were also buried with personal items, showing that even the youngest were believed to continue life in another realm. In some burials, imported silks, glass, and silver coins reflected the far-reaching trade connections of the Vikings. Ship burials remain the most spectacular finds. The Oseberg ship discovered in Norway contained two women of high rank with textiles, sledges, and carved wooden artifacts. Their wealth suggests they held significant authority, possibly religious or political. The Gokstad ship revealed the burial of a man with weapons, animals, and luxury items. These ships were not intended for sea travel, but symbolized vessels for the spiritual voyage into the afterlife. Cremation was equally meaningful. Bodies placed on pyres were believed to be transformed by fire, their souls released to the realm beyond. Sometimes ashes were gathered into urns, sometimes scattered beneath mounds. Evidence also shows that ships could be burned with their occupants, combining the symbols of fire and voyage into one powerful ritual. Funerals were public events, not private farewells. Families, warriors, and neighbors gathered, mourning and celebrating the dead, while affirming the strength of the community. The funeral of a chieftain, for example, also marked a political transition, reinforcing who would lead next. These ceremonies honored the deceased, but also secured the stability of the living. What emerges is a vision of funerals as both spiritual and social. Each item placed in a grave, each ritual performed, carried meaning. They reflected the identity of the dead, guided the soul on its journey, and reminded the living of their shared values. Honor, courage, and reputation were central to Norse culture, and funerals were a stage where these ideals were displayed. In Viking belief, death was not an end but a passage. Fire, ships, sacrifice, and grave goods worked together to prepare the soul and to preserve the legacy of the dead. These practices reveal a people who saw death as transformation, linking this world with the next through ritual and memory. The Viking funeral was more than a farewell to the dead, it was a bridge between worlds. By examining the symbols at the heart of these rituals, we can better understand what they meant to the Norse people and how they reflected their worldview. The ship was perhaps the most powerful of these symbols. For the Vikings, ships were not only practical tools for trade and warfare, but also representations of movement, freedom, and destiny. To place the dead in a ship, whether a real vessel or a symbolic wooden chamber, was to provide them with passage. Just as ships carried them across seas in life, they would now carry them across the unknown waters of death. Ship burials showed that the afterlife was a journey, one requiring the same tools and preparation as voyages in the mortal world. Fire was equally central. Flames were not seen merely as destruction, but as purification and transformation. Fire released the soul from its earthly body, sending it into the realm of spirits. The dramatic burning of ships, though rare, captured this belief vividly. Wood, cloth, and flesh consumed together, while smoke rose toward the sky. To the Norse, this was not loss but release, a transition that gave the deceased strength for their next existence. The role of the community in funerals cannot be overlooked. Death was a collective experience, and funerals reaffirmed social bonds. By gathering to honor the dead, people shared grief, told stories, and celebrated the life that had passed. These ceremonies reminded everyone of their duty to live with honor, so that they too would be remembered. For leaders and warriors, funerals were also political occasions. They showed wealth and influence, demonstrated alliances, and strengthened loyalty among followers. In this way, funerals serve both spiritual and worldly purposes. The presence of grave goods highlights the Norse vision of the afterlife. Unlike traditions that imagined a purely spiritual realm, the Vikings saw the next world as a continuation of this one. Weapons, tools, jewelry, animals, and food were necessary provisions. Even luxury items like silks or imported glass suggested that social identity carried into death. A warrior remained a warrior, a leader remained a leader, and a woman of influence continued her role in the community of spirits. Death did not erase these roles, but extended them into eternity. The variety of Viking funerals also shows the diversity of belief across their world. Some graves were modest, with little more than ashes in urns, while others, like the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, were filled with treasures. This difference reflected not only wealth but also local customs and personal choices. The Vikings were not bound by one rigid tradition but adapted their rituals to circumstances. This flexibility reveals a culture that valued both tradition and individuality. Underlying all these practices was the Norse view of fate. They believed that life was woven by the Norns, the mythical beings who shaped destiny. Death was inevitable, but how one lived determined how one was remembered. Funerals reinforced this idea, celebrating bravery, generosity, and honor. To be remembered in song and story was as important as any material offering. Memory itself was a form of immortality carried forward by family and community. The afterlife in Norse belief was not a single place. Warriors might join Odin in Valhalla or Freya in Fólkvangr. Farmers, craftsmen, and children might journey to hell, a realm of shadows but not necessarily of punishment. What mattered most was that the passage was honored with ritual. Funerals ensured that the dead did not wander but found their rightful place among the gods and ancestors. Today, the image of the Viking funeral still captures our imagination. Burning ships, drifting into the horizon, have become symbols of honor and dramatic endings. Yet the truth is both more complex and more human. Viking funerals were not just spectacles, but deeply personal and communal acts. They revealed love for the deceased, respect for tradition, and hope for safe passage into the next world. In the end, Viking funerals remind us of a culture that saw death not as an ending, but as transformation. Through fire, ships, grave goods, and community ritual, the Norse gave their dead the tools for the journey ahead. At the same time, they reminded the living of the values that defined their world: courage, honor, and memory. It was this balance between the living and the dead, the earthly and the spiritual, that gave the Viking funeral its lasting power.